Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan Danker. Welcome to Secondhand Religion. We're going to be talking about politics and the Christian life or Christian themes related to politics. I am the Associate Professor of Church History and Methodist Studies at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C.
I'm Cherie Harder, the President of the Trinity Forum, joining from Alexandria, Virginia.
I'm Marcus Walker. I'm the rector of St Bartholomew the Great in the City of London, and I'm joining from London.
I'm Jonathan Turtle. I'm the rector of the parish of Craighurst in Midhurst in beautiful Diocese of Toronto in Canada.
I'm Stanley Hauerwas. I'm the Gilbert T. Rowe Emeritus Professor of Theological Ethics at Duke Divinity School.
Well, welcome everyone to Secondhand Religion, and I'm glad to have this international panel here to talk about Christian themes, political themes, how do Christians think about politics. We live in what's perhaps a highly politicized time. There are questions in all of our countries and even outside of our countries of how do Christians engage in the political realm, or do they engage? There's been popular movements that say we should disengage. Throughout history, Christians have engaged in certain ways, and there have been certain themes that have driven Christian engagement. We're going to hopefully touch on some of those today and hopefully provide some information for those who want to explore this topic a bit further. But I do want to start out and Stanley, I'm gonna throw this one to you. How does your Christian faith inspire your approach to politics?
I think the way that I would put it is Christians are part of the political process the way porcupines screw very carefully. The idea that somehow Christians have got a peculiar political stance. The very question, what kind of government should Christians support, is already a Constantinian question that makes Christians politically irrelevant in many ways, just to the extent that we think we're going to run the world. You're not going to run the world. Christianity is now in the loser bracket. We no longer have the social and political stance that at one time let us believe that we could rule the world. We lost. We're free now. And so that means that we can have a participation in the world in which we find ourselves without presuming that we have to protect ourselves.
You started us out with some heavy thoughts there, Stanley. That's interesting, Constantinianism. John Wesley, who seems to be lingering over my shoulder here, hated the Constantinian settlement because he said it ruined discipleship.
But he was a Tory.
He was a high church Tory. Yes, he was. Yeah, an anti-establishmentarian. Marcus, what do you think? How does your faith inform your politics at a basic level?
Well, I suppose I'm coming at it from almost the opposite perspective from Stanley, being a great fan of the Constantinian model of the church and coming from a country which still officially has a state church, has bishops sitting in the legislature, and has its head of state as the supreme governor of that state church, which I think, I'm an Anglican, I suppose you could say I'm kind of paid to think this in Britain, but I think is a really positive model, but is, as Stanley has flagged up, one that's dying, and arguably one that in fact has died, and we're still just living in the husk of it. Christianity, however, seeps through here, certainly seeps through British culture and British thought, even in places that officially reject it. And I think that the whole way in which we think of how does a Christian engage in politics, how does a Christian engage with the state, how does a Christian engage with other people, has to be seen as a conversation between the way in which we always have done, for better or worse, the way in which we're called to in Scripture, and we read it and reflect on it ourselves and in dialogue with other Christians, and is something that we have to, and in all that, where we have to be quite careful to avoid the trap of thinking that as Christians we have policy solutions to any of the big questions. Really what we have is, well, not even a worldview. We have a whole series of overlapping worldviews which help us to look at questions in particular ways, and which we certainly now have to accept are not ways that other people are looking at these questions. Our voice is crucial. Our faith, I think, is essential in trying to form responses to the big questions of the world right now. But I think, and here I would agree with Stanley, we certainly shouldn't think we're the only ones with the answers, or that our answers are necessarily or have necessarily been right.
This is interesting because given the fact that there's been a rising conversation, at least amongst academic circles, of a political theology, which is arguably a basic question of how Christians are to engage the political state. Are there ways in which the tradition either challenges that or perhaps enables us to formulate a political theology? Can you think of something from the tradition itself? And I'm going to first throw this toward Jonathan. When you think of your own formation in the Christian tradition, are there ways in which that formation then shaped a political theology that you would identify as Christian? Is that a fair question?
I'd say it's a fair question. It's a tricky one for me as a priest and a pastor, because absolutely agree with what's been said so far. The voice and the witness of the church is vital, but the word that stood out to me from what Stanley was talking about there was the word carefully, right? Because I think for Christians, at the center of our life and witness is the cross. And that's a problem because it means that part of the Christian vocation means that we have to learn to win by losing. And so much of contemporary politics concerns winning by casting a vote or winning by getting the most seats and the most power, and therefore being able to assert your will over others, right? Whereas at the center of the Christian faith stands the cross. And that means that if we're going to be Christians, we're going to have to learn to lose and be patient and bear with one another and find a life that flourishes there. So it's a fair question, but it's a complicated one because I think as Christians, that's where we have to start, right? Is at a sort of state execution outside the city walls, and that complicates things pretty quickly in my view.
There's something about the resurrection then too, isn't there? I mean, the cross, obviously, there's a political statement in the cross. And I think the fact that Christians didn't use the cross for the first few centuries was a repercussion of the political ramifications of the cross. But there's also the reality that the resurrection is the ultimate victory of God, and perhaps we should look to the resurrection as our ultimate victory rather than political battles every 2 to 4 years or 5, depending on your political system.
I think that one of the presuppositions that Christians have is that there is a form of government that is compatible, if not intrinsic, to what it means to be Christian. And that's democracy. The only problem with that is we don't have the slightest idea what in the hell a democracy is. So the idea that, for example, elections are the heart of democratic life, and I'm I certainly want to support the business of election, but you forget that elections are in many ways non-democratic because it's where 50.1% get to tell 99.9% what to do. So the very idea that elections are the heart of democratic life is problematic, just to the extent that you forget an election is where you create conditions necessary for the articulation of goods in common that make a people a people. And that's very hard to do.
I would just like to take a little issue with the idea that democracy is automatically the epitome of a Christian government. I mean, I think these days, well, all of us in the West certainly presume that democracy is by definition best and good, with a whole load of caveats. But actually, historically, the idea that democracy defines Christian government would have been looked at with astonishment and even ridicule. I mean, for a large portion of history, what defines a good Christian government is somebody who is anointed, who's transformed, somebody who is set aside to rule, ideally somebody who's prepared and trained for that rule and pray and is a good churchman, but nonetheless, you know, what is it that changes them? What is it that sets them to rule? It's anointing, sacral anointing. It's the descent of the Holy Spirit upon that person. The idea that God moves, and the idea that God moves through people, through the demos, is quite startlingly new, and arguably is a thesis that we're testing, perhaps even to destruction at the moment. And it perhaps goes back to the fact that in all of the models of government that people attempt to anoint, to bless, to sacralize, we're dealing with human beings who end up returning to the raw matter of human beings and to their sinful nature every time they get anywhere near power.
Fool whispers in the anointed's ear, dust you are and to dust you shall return.
Oh yes, that's the most important role, arguably.
Well, I want to hear from Cherie, and so I'm gonna give this question to her. How are Christians to respond to one another, and even to non-Christians during political debate? Is there a limit to Christian engagement in the public square, or perhaps a Christian approach to this engagement that you think is unique?
That's a lot of questions in there, but yes, I can tell you, actually, there's a lot that can be said about what a Christian approach to each other should be in the public square. But I think one of the things we can safely say should not be our approach is actually one of the things that defines our public square now. And that is the growth of expressions of contempt, fear, anger, what's been referred to as the rise of affective polarization, such that we don't simply disagree with others. We regard them with fear, anger, and contempt, and regard them as evil and stupid. And it's actually grown to such an extent that there have been different surveys out that show that I think it's supposed to be around 15% of Republicans and 20% of Democrats think that essentially the public square would be better off if large portions of the other party simply died. So I think we can safely say this is not a Christian approach. It is opposed to the idea of love of neighbor and the Imago Dei. And those two simple principles, I think, are actually quite good ones for guiding our treatment of others in the public square, the ways that we interact. That is not limited to the adverbial, how we treat others, but certainly includes them. And I think there's increasing need for simply the adverbial in terms of the way we interact in the public square, such that essentially listening to each other, wanting the good of the other, working towards the good of the other, are fairly radical Christian concepts now in terms of how they interact in the public square. To some of your other questions, one thing I will say, and this probably pertains a little bit to what's been said already, is I think one of of the distorting factors of our political engagement is that we, and perhaps in some ways especially, sort of self-professed Christians, have freighted politics with too much weight and importance, and that we look to our politics to solve questions and provide answers to things that politics simply cannot do. Politics should not be providing us with the core sources of our identity. And I think you increasingly see an identitarian aspect to our politics, which also further intensifies and accelerates that affective polarization that I mentioned. There's a sense that, again, to even engage with the other with whom we disagree is somehow tantamount to capitulation, if not moral corruption.
Right.
That is certainly at odds with any kind of democratic form of government, but I think it's also at odds with some of the core convictions of our Christian faith, that we too are sinners saved by grace, which should endow us with a certain amount of, I guess you could call it, epistemological modesty in terms of the realms of what we know and the purity of our own motives. So I think those are just a few things that might be helpful guides to our public engagement.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much more to add than what Cherie just said. That was really well put. And, the growing polarization, I think, has something to do with the witness of the church at this particular time, and how can we be real communities on the ground that resist this sort of polarization. And, absolutely, I see the same thing with respect to how we identify. So, what would it mean for Christians at this point in time as part of our witness to, say, abstain from being card-carrying members of any particular political party, right? Not saying don't vote, but, if someone asks you, are you liberal or conservative or NDP or Republican or Democrat, what would it mean what would it mean for our witness as Christians to be able to say, well, no, actually, to a question like that? And I just see it on the ground as a pastor, and even in rural Ontario, little parishes that I get to serve up here, where I've seen people leave a little country church over political divisions, or rather over sort of bioethical matters, for example, that different political parties might have answers to. I've seen people leave their Christian brothers and sisters over, you're conservative, I'm liberal, we've got different responses to the question of abortion or whatever it might be, and sort of take up and leave. And to me, that's disheartening. And I think we're called to a higher standard than that. And I think the church has an opportunity to show the world what it means to bear with one another in love. And but the success to which we're doing that, I think, is up for grabs.
One thing I think is worth adding too is what Christians can be too nice to each other about also reflects a little bit of what the priorities are. In many of those same circles, not supporting the president can get you drummed down, excommunicated from the social circle very quickly. So it's sort of what we choose as our boundaries for that kind of forbearance, I think also says a little bit about how we're oriented.
I mean, Cherie, you brought up something I think is vitally important to the historic Christian witness, which is the acknowledgement of the Imago Dei. That the people we engage with inside the church, we're engaging with people who we share the waters of baptism with, for crying out loud. That's a profound thing. But even outside of that, we share with all people the fact that we're made in the image of God. how, you know, I like the fact that you brought that into the conversation, because that was the driving force behind a lot of the abolitionist movement of the evangelical revival. And I think was a real positive thing that the church ultimately offered. Finney, right? Wesley, Wilberforce, that lots of,
May I cut in with just a reflection there? I think there's the seeing in those with whom we're arguing the image of God, the image and likeness of God, is hugely important. I'm perhaps a little more hesitant than others to delegitimize the Christianity of those with whom I disagree, even with those with whom I disagree profoundly theologically. And I mean, I'd spin it around the opposite direction. I don't know very much about the American religious right, I have to confess, so I can't really engage in the theological controversies there. But I would say that you could quite easily make the argument that those who see the man who refused to be a zealot in his earthly ministry and try to make the worship of him into modern zealotry as we to oppose the structures of oppression, etc., is also theologically problematic. But I have to see in them, and should see and want to see in them, those people who have one way or another encountered the divine and who are working it out in a way that's just profoundly different from the way that I have. One of the things that I really love about my congregation here is it's a profoundly political congregation. We have a Labour peer and a Tory peer who sit next to each other. The head of policy for the Liberal Democrats is deputy head server. We've got one of the sort of a couple of the seriously big figures in the Remain movement come along, and then you've got Darren Grimes, who was the young lad who's heavily involved in the Leave movement. What I found fascinating is during the really intense political fervour of the last 2 to 3 years, they all still get on. And there was a very interesting time when that lad Darren Grimes, who's now just been investigated by the police for something that he published, who is at that point being investigated for electoral malpractice. He watched. There was a BBC film about Brexit that came up that featured him. He chose to watch it with some of the other young lads at church, most of whom were Remainers, and that was where he actually found safety. Was with people with whom he shared that baptism and shared that approach to the Eucharist and all the rest, not people who shared his politics. Mm-hmm. And you can see that across the different political fights with different people across the last few years. And that is something I'm delighted to find myself pastoring in the midst of. I mean, predated me. I wouldn't like to claim that that's anything to do with me, but it's wonderful. It really does model, I think, how we Christians should engage with each other, which is, we might profoundly disagree, we might argue like cats and dogs, but actually the person with whom I'm arguing is a person whom I'm going to give the respect and the dignity to of actually being a Christian and trying to work out what is best.
So what you're saying is that there are core convictions that actually form the politic of that community that expand beyond the governmental politics in which you live.
I would hope there are core convictions. I wouldn't even go so far to say for certain that they all share those core convictions. Mm. I think what it is they share the belief that the other people are good people trying to do good, even if they profoundly disagree with the way in which they're doing it. And actually, perhaps it's that recognition that there's that spark of something good in the other person that's so important for our dialogue.
This actually extends right into a question that I think a lot of people are dealing with, or maybe not dealing with, because it sounds like all of us are saying that Christians do belong to a certain extent in the political sphere. It's almost like we haven't read the Benedict option. I thought we were not supposed to be in the political sphere. Do you have further thoughts on this, about whether or not we belong in the political sphere?
Alistair, who is a friend, has told me that the sentence that he most regrets having written is, "We need a new Saint Benedict," because people read that as a kind of withdrawal.
You mean
The
Alistair
issue
McGrath?
is not withdrawing or
McIntyre.
gaining. I'm sorry,
You mean McIntyre?
McIntyre.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who did I say?
You just said his first name.
Oh, the issue is not involvement or withdrawal. I mean, if there's no place to withdraw to, you're surrounded. And the question is how, in the world in which we find ourselves, can we be a people who, as has been said, respect the dignity of our enemy in a way that makes true argument true. That is what Christians can give to the world.
And maybe particularly Anglicans. There's a particular charism that I think Anglicans might have if we can actually work out how to do it, which is having been formed deliberately in a way that tried to allow as many people with as many competing theologies to exist within one house, and then has grown up with new competing theologies vying for supremacy at different points in our history, and now have had to engage in a whole series of civil wars across a number of issues, across all sorts of provinces and churches. At our best, we are able, at the very least, to advise people what not to do in the course of having their debates, and to show that you can at its best disagree well. You can try to work out how to hold people with seriously different theologies in the same camp. Well, if we can do that with theology, hopefully we can do that with politics too.
I also have an interest in seeing Christians understand their political life a little more broadly. I mean, I have a sense that when Christians think about what it means to be politically engaged, we think chiefly of stepping into a voting booth and casting our vote. I think that's one of the least political things that Christians engage in on a regular basis. Think about what it means to gather for worship every Sunday and announce that Jesus is Lord. That's a political statement, and we do that in churches all across the world every week, day in and day out. What does it mean to put your hand to the work that God has given you to do today? What does it mean to invest in your local communities? What does it mean to have families or to engage in your work well? I think those are all political questions that have to do with how we organize our life together. And I think that the gospel, when held up, sheds light on that, right? I mean, here we've got a vision of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And yeah, on the ground, when we cast a vote, political parties, we may have different ways of trying to achieve some of those ends for a more just and equitable society. But ultimately, I think that this is something that, isn't going to be legislated, but that we might be able to live out together as we bear with one another, as we put our hand to the work that we've been given, as we raise families, as we nurture the life of our local communities and neighborhoods. So I'd want to see Christians begin to understand their political life more broadly than simply casting a vote or garnering support for a particular candidate or party.
One thing I'd love to just add there is I think sometimes the metaphors that we use when we think of how we engage in the public square, which of course includes political activity, matters as well. And at least in the States for the last few decades, sort of culture war has been one of the dominant metaphors that we have used. And I think that that not only reflects but also affects our thinking. We tend to marshal arguments and deploy resources, and the aim is to take back territory that we believe has been taken from us. You know, many of us here, many of our viewers are probably familiar with Mako Fujimura and Mark Labberton at Fuller. They've been very explicit about offering different kinds of metaphors. The idea of culture as a garden to be cultivated, not a battleground to be seized, and that kind of orients one's thinking in a different way towards investment, towards cultivation and generation. Essentially investing the culture with love and resources and care, rather than essentially trying to seize the spoils. And I think that can often be important, just in terms of how we as Christians think about our public, cultural, and including political involvement.
I think one of the things that needs to be said, I'm committed to Christian nonviolence, and people oftentimes think that that takes you out of the political realm. I think it forces you into the political realm, exactly because you'd rather have an argument than to kill someone. But what I think we currently are facing is a crisis politically, because what's at stake is the rule of law. And the rule of law has been one of the great achievements that has managed to keep people limited in terms of their ability to kill one another. And right now, the rule of law is under great stress. And that needs, Christians really have a stake in maintaining that political achievement.
That's good. That's good. We could do an entire show on that. But it did remind me, we have a question about Christ's kingdom language. Because he didn't use language of the nation state, which might cause problems for those who live in a modern nation state to try to understand how to apply some of his teachings. Marcus, did you want to address the issue of kingdom language? Is there a political nature to kingdom language? Is there a use of kingdom language that we should embrace or not?
I think one of the interesting elements of kingdom language, I suppose, is that we're talking about two totally different things in a way here. Mm-hmm. The first is we could spend the rest of the session on an exegesis of what Christ means by the kingdom when he talks about it, when he's talking about the kingdom of heaven, when he's talking about the kingdom of heaven being within the disciples, when he jumps from the kingdom of heaven being like the treasure in the field, and when the kingdom of heaven is like the merchant hunting the pearl of great price. What does he mean by all of that? We can jump around as to what the kingdom means there, what we mean in the Lord's Prayer when we say when we pray thy kingdom come, and whether we mean it now and whether it's discernible now. And then the other type of, when we talk about kingdom language, the other thing we mean quite often is when people are seeking to build the kingdom of heaven on earth, quite often following ideologies that are not especially heavenly, although each person who is pursuing them thinks that there is a conflation between their vision of the kingdom and what should happen now on earth. I think we've seen this throughout history, whether it's the Constantinian and post-Constantinian attempt in the Roman Empire to conflate the oikoumene, the entire people of God, with the entire world, with the Roman Empire. Whether we see it in Latin America now with certain types of liberation theology. If I'm going to be controversial, I would tend to see in these desires to build the kingdom on earth using all the tools, or using all of our earthly tools, as accepting the second temptation, or the third temptation, depending on which version we're using. That we're taken up to the high mountain and shown all the kingdoms of the earth, and told that we can have them if we but bow down and worship. And we're told, and the temptation for Christ, I always think there is, you can liberate the captives, you can feed the starving. If you are prepared to do it by force, you don't have to go to the cross. And my concern with an awful lot of kingdom language is that what we're doing is accepting that we can build what we think the kingdom of heaven should look like here on earth using our earthly weapons. And it always leads to one version or another of an inquisition or a camp.
I think the kingdom language is eschatological all the way down. And what that means is that the fundamental duality is between church and world. I put it this way, that the first task of the church is not to make the world more just, but to make the world the world. Because the world cannot know it is the world unless there is an alternative. So how Christians negotiate the politics in which we find ourselves depends very much on the insights that have come from how the church has discovered it must live if it is to be a witness to the kingdom that's based on a cross.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking about it. I mean, the church has to be different, does it not? Stanley, you put it in a different way. I remember the church must be the church of the world is already damned. And I'm reminded in that kind of language that well, you see it in some of the oldest literature of the Christian church. In Clement's letter to the Corinthians from Rome, he refers to the Corinthian church as a colony of the kingdom, refers to the church in Rome as that colony. Stanley, you and Willman have talked about resident aliens in a similar vein. Is there a role that the church has? And I'm trying to also include Marcus's caution here that we shouldn't try to create some kind of utopian vision based on our own efforts. But how does the church then act like the church or act like the kingdom in the world so that it actually fulfills its function? That's a heavy question, though.
I'm sorry, you're asking me?
Well, if you want to jump in, that'd be great.
Well, I think Marcus is right that you begin with the worship of God and the liturgical formation of a people who know how to pray is a fundamental political achievement.
You know, Ryan, I'll throw in a perhaps, I'm not sure, but perhaps slightly contrarian idea, which is there's always tension with these things too. You know, I think of Martin Luther King Jr.'s letters from Birmingham jail addressed to the white moderate pastors. And there needs to, I mean, somewhere between apathy or even complicity and injustice and thinking we can bring in the kingdom and restore justice, you know, there's tension between those poles. But, you know, the church must never forget its primary mission. And yet, obvious injustice in front of our face should not be a matter of indifference to us either.
Well, and I'm often struck by the witness of the early church that, you know, did not remain apathetic to various injustices around them, right? But were known for taking on that care upon themselves, right? I mean, caring for the elderly and the sick, caring for infants rather than discarding them, right? All of these were markers of the witness of the church that at best made them a bit peculiar, and at worst made them a threat. But they accomplished that witness by actually putting their money where their mouth was, right? And caring for those folks rather than simply, seeking legislation for someone else to care for those folks. I think often of a palliative care hospice here in Toronto that started when a little storefront church in the inner city gathered around a man that was dying of AIDS. And he bequeathed his estate to them and asked them to care for other people in the same way that they cared for him. That was a responsibility that they took on. That was a cost that they were willing to pay, and it's borne good fruit. And so I think the kingdom language can be helpful there in both respects. It reminds us ultimately of our own calling and vocation to be the church, while at the same time reminding us that this does happen in the world that we live in communities that we live in with bodies that we bump up against on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. That's good, and it brings me to the last two questions, which have a practical element too. That you mentioned bumping into people, Jonathan. That's very practical. The last two questions I want to cover in this video. One, can you think of a Christian figure who has role modeled Christian political engagement? Of course, I'm a church history guy. I look for these figures. That's my job. And I also highlight ones who failed at things too. But obviously, I enjoy finding the role models. Can you think of? Is there a role model that pops up in your mind? I'll give you an example. And hopefully, I'm not stealing one of yours. Whenever when I think of a politician in particular who I think embodied his Christian faith, I think of Senator Mark Hatfield, senator from Oregon. And he was, it was a different era. He was a moderate Republican. We don't have moderates at all anymore, but he was a moderate Republican who, he was the only one who voted against the Vietnam War in the Senate. And he was pro-life. And he was concerned about the environment, and all this, and it all kind of sprung from his deep formation in the Quaker Church. So that's just an example. Do any of you have figures that you'd like to highlight? Cherie, you're smiling, so I'm going to throw this one.
Sure, I'll jump in. My very first job out of college was working as a legislative correspondent, which basically just means a glorified letter answerer for Senator Jack Danforth from Missouri. And certainly Senator Danforth was not perfect. He had his foibles like everyone else, but it was a helpful experience for me as a 21-year-old, 22-year-old in terms of modeling. He provided a model of someone who took his faith very seriously, and it did inform the way he conducted himself, the way he certainly his positions, but the way he bumped up against people, to borrow Jonathan's phrase. Later, I spent probably at least 15 years on Capitol Hill. William Wilberforce was certainly one of the patron saints for many many members of the House and the Senate. There again, Wilberforce had his flaws, foibles, frailties, whatnot, but did model someone who, really remarkably creative ways to try to extend love of neighbor, pursue justice, help cultivate flourishing, all of that. And did so, again, not as a sort of a solo figure, but enmeshed in community, and a very interesting community, which included Josiah Wedgwood, a potter, which, in sharp contrast to many communities at the time, women had a very active role, an active intellectual role. It was a remarkable community that I think in many ways mirrored, aspects of our faith that were not part of the culture at all at the time. So they're imperfect examples, but those would be a few I'd toss out.
The monks at Tribune in Algeria and Dorothy Day.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
And I would obviously be, well, there's always going to be a danger that when you're the only British person on a panel, you're going to say the Queen. But there is something quite astonishing now in a culture that is becoming increasingly secular. For the head of state regularly, not just to bring up her faith, but actually to express a theology and a public theology as well. And I think this was most clear during the pandemic, when arguably she was the most prominent she was the most prominent person engaging theologically with the enormity of what was happening. And I was very struck by the fact that on Easter Eve, there was a secular campaign to put a candle out in your window, or hold your candle up in memory of those who had died. Now, you might think that Easter Eve is a day on which Christians might have something to say about death, candles, and resurrection.
Mm.
But the bishops of the Church of England, most of whom engaged in this, and the sort of word clearly went out on, you must do a tweet with holding a candle. And it was all in memory of those who had died, full stop. The Queen put out a video, straight out of the blue, in which she had a sustained 10-minute reflection on candles, light, death, and resurrection, and how it was light shining in darkness, and how the light that was coming into the darkness was Christ's resurrection. And that's what we Christians believe today. And actually, that's an incredibly brave thing to do in a country that now only has 2% of people going to an Anglican church and probably another 2% going to any other church. Actually, putting yourself, when you're supposed to be the figure for unity for everybody, it's much easier to be Magnolia and say nothing. We don't do God, as Alistair Campbell said to Tony Blair. And yet, she felt that in the middle of a pandemic, her job as head of state was actually to make a theological statement about life and hope and Christ. And actually, that's quite big right now.
Closer to home here in Canada, the name Tommy Douglas is often brought up in conversations like these. Tommy Douglas was a Baptist pastor who rose to prominence as the leader of the NDP. And I suppose I can't really say don't quote me on this on a video like this, but I believe it was his party under his leadership that the first universal healthcare system was established or was proposed in North America. So, I think you could argue that this came out of his vision of the good, the true, and the beautiful, right? That people ought to be able to access healthcare, for example, right? Now, I think, as we've sort of talked about already, that needs to come with a certain humility about, are we building the kingdom of God here or not? But certainly that vision of justice and access to healthcare for those who ordinarily might not be able to afford it is a good thing, and he gets mentioned in these sorts of conversations up here.
It was a Methodist who helped to form the NHS in Britain. I don't know if Marcus. Yeah. So one last takeaway. These are all wonderful. What I want to do is end this video with ways that we can help viewers to engage more in their own content. So can you think of, let's just go with two, and you don't have to expand on them if you don't want to. Are there two themes, Christian themes, that you think are primary when Christians are engaging political sphere, political ideology? Are there two themes from the faith that you bring to it when in your own engagement that you would highlight? For me, I can think of the Imago Dei is a big part of my political ideology, and I get it from Wesley. I'll admit it. to me, that speaks to the way that we should care for one another, and it speaks against violence. So I think that's a Christian theme that inspires my political engagement. Stanley, do you want to start us out?
You no doubt know Jason Michelli over in Alexandria Methodist.
I do know him, yeah.
He's a terrific Methodist, and he puts out T-shirts with a phrase that I once said: "Jesus, Lord, and everything else is just bullshit."
Right.
That's as political as you can get.
There you go. I think another member of the panel actually owns that T-shirt. I don't know if he's going to admit it on here, but he does.
I should have worn it. Because we've got Wesley looming over your shoulder there, I'll say holiness. What does it mean for us to be set apart? What does it mean to not accept the rules that you're handed, but to look at how Christians might be invited to participate and live out their lives in a way that is distinct from those around them, right? And attending themes of patience and humility and other things like that come to mind as well.
Cherie, Marcus, any ideas?
Sure. Well, one I will sort of toss out that I don't know that I would at other times say that this is of primary importance, but it seems to be of increasing importance in our own context, and that is a love of truth. Part of why I say that is, we're entering a time when we increasingly disagree not just about what is right and wrong, but even about what happened. And you see so many controversies get spun up over what is essentially people buying into conspiracy theories, obvious distortions and the like. And one of the things that should characterize us, of course, is the love of truth. One does not have wisdom, without it. The second, which is the most basic, which has been we've talked about before, is love of neighbor. If the gospel can be summed up into love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, love of neighbor seems a very important one to bring to all of our public and certainly political interactions. It's also obviously profoundly countercultural, and especially now. One of the things I think we've probably all been struck by is the language that is often used in political contexts particularly, but which has then spread to other contexts as well. And it's largely the language of domination and humiliation. I mean, we talk about owning the libs or owning the right wing, triggering them, making their heads explode. It's essentially the language of slavery, of relishing, inflicting emotional distress, and it is absolutely a poison to living together, despite difference. So I think if Christians really leaned into modeling love of neighbor, what a difference it would make.
It was interesting. I was going to say the first question should be, who is my neighbor?
Mm-hmm.
And that actually, if we ask ourselves that all the time, the answer that we get is going to be quite significant. Of course, what we do with the answer will be different depending on depending upon the lenses with which we read the world and politics and economics and all the rest. And the question of how to help the poor will be different depending on the degree to which you think that free markets work better than command economies, etc. And you can extrapolate that all the way down. But the first question of who is my neighbor, and always to ask yourself that, who is my neighbor, and to remember what Christ's answer was, is a very good place to start. And the second is, what does it mean to be incarnated? What does it mean to be here and in the world, and to be engaging in the world and with the world? And what does that mean? Yes, and what does it mean to be doing that as Christians? Because that's always a tough question. It's very easy to be doing that just as markers and thinking, Cherie said, I'm going to own the other person. I'm going to thump the other person. I'm going to send my tanks into the neighboring country. But if I had tanks. The question of how to do that as a Christian, how to engage with the people with whom I profoundly disagree as a Christian, is the question of our time. Because if we don't start acting like Christians in the public square, nobody else is going to do it, and we are heading towards, I think, we're heading towards not just a civil war, but a sort of an international civil war, as we all stop being able to speak to each other.
Well, this has been very rich, and thank you, Jonathan, Cherie, Marcus, Stanley. We could talk about some of the issues we brought up for hours and hours, and I hope that the viewers will glean from this useful tools as they engage in the political sphere where they are. But thank you for being here, and thank you for watching Secondhand Religion.